Every list of great films, of course, many of them lead with Citizen Kane and say it's the finest film made. Do you agree?
No, certainly not.
That's
My next one is, though. That's going to make history.
Could you give us the title of that?
I haven't decided what it is yet.
Oh. I see.
On November 2nd, 2018, Netflix released Orson Welles' final film, The Other Side of the Wind, on their streaming platform. Most people who worked on the film didn't live to see its release, including Orson himself, who had died 33 years prior. Many believed this project would never see the light of day. For many years, it was locked in a vault, constantly at the center of much political and legal scrutiny. The story of the longest film production ever was never going to be a simple one, but it may surprise you that it actually began even before Citizen Kane was conceived. No, that doesn't surprise you? Well, it actually does, so. At 22, long before Orson Welles created Citizen Kane, the film many deemed to be the greatest of all time, he was more successful than most artists could ever dream of being. He had his own theater company and was making over $1,000 a week as The Shadow.
Who's that?
I am the Shadow.
Wells was hired to do the voiceover work for Ernest Hemingway's script for The Spanish Earth, a leftist Spanish Civil War documentary. Hemingway was 37. By this point, he had already written The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. But this didn't stop the 22-year-old Wells from entering the recording studio and making changes to Hemingway's script.
And I said, is it really necessary to say this? Do you think wouldn't it be better to just see the picture? And things like that. And then I heard this growl from the darkness, you know? Some damn faggot who runs an art theater trying to tell me how to write narration. So I began to camp it up. I thought, if that's what I'm dealing with, I said, oh, Mr. Hemingway, you think because you're so big and strong and have hair on your chest that you try to bully me, you see? So this great figure stood up and swung at me. So I swung at him. Now you have the picture of the Spanish Civil War being projected on a screen, and these two heavy figures swinging away at each other and missing most of the time. The lights came up and we looked at each other and burst into laughter and became great friends.
In the time between Hemingway and Orson's first meeting, Wells went on to direct Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons, and The Lady from Shanghai, 3 films that today are considered to be some of the greatest ever created. Although they were artistic triumphs, they financially underperformed, so the studios deemed Wells unemployable. He fled to Europe where he would create Othello, an entirely self-funded adaptation of Shakespeare's play that was made over a span of 3 years due to lack of funding, something Wells would not be a stranger to in the future. He would return to Hollywood in the mid-50s to star and direct Touch of Evil, one of the greatest noirs of the Golden Age. If you haven't seen this movie, you've definitely seen its opening shot, which features a 3.5-minute unbroken take that builds towards a bomb explosion. Similar to his other work, it underperformed and he fled to Europe again, where he continued to work on his adaptation of Don Quixote, a project that he would never finish. Hemingway's death is what inspired Wells to begin development on what would become his final film.
And our story is about a pseudo Hemingway. A movie director belongs to that league which in Spain they call the macho.
The story was initially about a Hemingway-esque bullfighter, but eventually Wells scrapped the whole bullfighting thing and changed the lead into an aging director.
He's a tough movie director who has killed 3 or 4 extras in every picture.
The director, named Jake Hannaford, is mounting a comeback during the inception of the new Hollywood, where young film students began to take over the industry and injected American film with a European style. The story would take place at Hannaford's 70th birthday party, where pieces of his experimental European-inspired art film is being screened. Wells' aim for The Other Side of the Wind, which he ended up titling it down the line, was to be his comeback film. He saw the new Hollywood movement as the perfect opportunity to return home. The now young industry, although they didn't choose to fund his films, grew up studying his work. Wells was now a legend, so there was no better time for him to reclaim his place in the city that he helped build.
I was at Schwab's drugstore in Hollywood, and I read in Variety that Orson Welles was in town at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I went back to the phone booth, called him up, and to my surprise, he answered the phone. Hello? I said, Orson Welles? Yes, who is this? I introduced myself, Gary Graver. I said, I'm an American cameraman, et cetera, et cetera. He says, well, I'm very busy. I'm on my way to the airport. He says, I've got to go to New York to make a picture. He took my number and he said, call me later. I said, okay, that's fine, that's pretty good. So I went home, I drove up Laurel Canyon to my house. As I pulled in my driveway, the phone was ringing. I ran into my house, picked up the phone. Gary, this is Orson. Get over to the Beverly Hills Hotel right away. I've got to talk to you.
Graver was a jack of all trades. He got his start as a cinematographer and editor on various B-movies. Throughout the 70s and 80s, he primarily worked in low-budget horror films, even directing a few of his own, and was a prominent adult film director under the pseudonym
Actof Talmud. That's vodka gimlet spelled backwards.
He says, I have a great idea for a movie, and I would like to work with you. He said, you're the second cameraman that's called me up. The first one was Greg Toland on Citizen Kane. He says, now you. So it must mean good luck.
Graver was confident that Welles's lack of funding wouldn't be a problem. Graver assured him that they could make a movie on a tight budget by assembling a young, non-union crew willing to work for less than $200 a week. I bet they gave him internship hours. They also had access to lighting, sound equipment, and an editing table. After hours of discussion, they realized that they had almost everything they needed to start filming except for a cast, a final script, and a proper financier. In the meanwhile, they would begin with the $750,000 Orson had already set aside. When production began on the film, they didn't have a lead. Welles knew who he wanted, but they didn't cast him yet. So, Welles decided to play the role off camera, and they would film Hannaford's scenes when they finally casted him. Peter Bogdanovich, a protege of Welles and a working film critic, was cast as Higham, a journalist writing a book about the director character. Coincidentally, Bogdanovich at the time was working on a book about Welles. I guess that's what you'd call good casting. For the time, the film was actually shot in a pretty inventive way. The party was shot as a pseudo-documentary, with many of its scenes improvised. And then the film within a film scenes, starring Bob Random and Oja Kodar, Welles's lover, was shot in the European avant-garde style Welles hated and aimed to satirize. He was intentionally mocking Michelangelo Antonioni, whose film Blow Up was a huge inspiration for the avant-garde movement. Welles was famous for his opinions. In the later years of his life, he was a frequent guest on many primetime talk shows. However, he would rarely talk poorly about any of his contemporaries, except for Antonioni. He once said, according to a young film critic, one of the greatest discoveries of our age is the value of boredom as an artistic subject. If that's the case, Antonioni deserves to be counted as a pioneer and founding father. Oh boy. The true inspiration for Welles's film within a film was Antonioni's Zabriskie Point, which was a total critical and commercial failure at the time. Although he hated the style, according to close accounts, a crew member looked at a shot in awe and exclaimed, "Antonioni never got a shot like that." Welles replied, "You bet your sweet ass he didn't." You really can't blame him. Sometimes it's just fun to create empty images. Welles attributes most of what he knows about a camera to Greg Toland, the cinematographer of Citizen Kane. Coming from the theater, Welles didn't know a thing about making movies. This excited Toland, since this meant Welles didn't know the limitations of the medium. He made what at the time were impossible requests, but these requests led to innovations, and that's why Citizen Kane is the landmark film that it is. This idea in theory is brilliant. As creatives, we should constantly be trying to push the medium forward. One of my favorite Stanley Kubrick quotes is, "Never say no to an idea. You never know how that idea will ignite another idea." But while being lost in the idea of creative theory, it's important to remember that even if an idea may produce a bold and exciting product, sometimes it just doesn't. Welles never abandoned his idea to creatively innovate, but some young filmmakers of the 70s just didn't have the patience for his methods. As a result, they cycled through crew members. However, there were many members of the crew who did have infinite patience, especially Graver, who never said no to a request, no matter how ridiculous and childlike it may have seemed. But then there were the accounts of a photographer, for example, who compared Welles to a mean Santa Claus. Another crew member was uncomfortable by spending more than an hour trying to lift the overweight Welles into a trunk of a car so he could direct the scene through the hole in a back seat. In the beginning of 1971, Orson decided they needed to beef up the crew. Graver, who was hired as the cameraman, was not just doing the camera work. He hired the crew, fed them, dealt with permits, and much more. Polly Platt, Peter Bogdanovich's soon-to-be ex-wife, was called to do the art direction. They also brought in Frank Marshall, the production manager on Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, as a line producer. He probably won't have much success in his future, in my opinion. Bringing in more crew helped move the production along, but it did not stop Welles's past from catching up with him. Between 1971 and 1973, production on The Other Side of the Wind stalled as Welles faced financial difficulties and pressure from the IRS due to the unpaid fines from previous decades. Wells sought financing and was introduced to Dominique Antony, who had connections with Mehdi Bouchari, a wealthy Iranian producer. Wells was reluctant to have his film financed, but Antony convinced him to meet with Bouchari, leading Wells to securing $150,000 to continue the project. This finally allowed Wells to bring on the leading man he had his eye on since the beginning. John Huston. John Huston.
I said, Mr. Huston, I'm really thrilled you're here. I said, I've been waiting for you for 3 years to be in this film. We've been shooting around you. And Huston suddenly looked really alarmed. He said, you've been acting in this picture for 3 years?
With Huston finally cast, Wells rounded out the remaining parts. The most important part needed to be filled was Brooks Otterlake. Otterlake is a former protege of Hannaford who set out to write a book about his mentor. But after directing 3 consecutive hit films, he abandons the project and becomes one of the most prominent young directors in Hollywood. Their relationship is the emotional core of the film. So it was only natural for Wells to cast comedian Rich Little as the part of Brooks Outerlake in his non-autobiographical film. Susan Strasberg, fans of the channel will know her Father Lee, was cast as Juliette Rich, a character based on film critic Pauline Kael. In 1970, Kael challenged the auteur theory, which was supported by her rival Andrew Sarris, by arguing that Wells's co-writer, Herman J. Mankiewicz, was the true genius behind Citizen Kane. This, of course, hurt Wells. Even though Wells deemed Kane to be his biggest curse, a success that nobody will let him surpass, it was undoubtedly a massive part of his legacy that Kael claimed was a phony one. Wells and Kael had a public dispute over the matter, and many of Wells' supporters, including Bogdanovich, came publicly to his defense. The production continued to struggle financially during filming. Things began to get a little complicated during this stage of the production because there's a lot of money being thrown around. So here's a paraphrased summary that helps explain this era in Wells' life by Barbara Lamming, his biographer. While in Paris during a filming hiatus, Wells was able to secure 2 major backers, the Iranian group that we mentioned earlier and a Spanish acquaintance who voluntarily contribute a large sum of his own cash. The plan was to film in Spain before moving the production back to Arizona because of poor weather. But while Wells was filming in Spain, his Spanish partner was supposed to act as the middleman between him and the Iranians. The Iranians would give their sum of cash to the Spanish producer, who would then deliver it to Wells. As time went on, the producer told Wells that the Iranians hadn't been living up to their end of the deal, claiming he was only receiving small sums from them. At this point, the Iranians had no idea that there were any financial problems on the production, as they were delivering money to Wells' Spanish partner. The Iranians received a telex from the Spaniard, supposedly from Huston's agent, requesting a $60,000 advance for Huston. The Iranians sent that $60,000, which the partner then pocketed instead of giving to Huston, who was actually working for much less out of friendship for Wells. After sending the money, Dominique started having second thoughts. Up until now, she had deliberately left Wells alone, sensing that he preferred it that way. She traveled to Arizona, and since Wells had yet to receive a penny from the Iranians, their French representative was the last person he expected to see out there. Almost immediately, he asked where the money was. She nervously admitted she had been making regular payments to the intermediary, who clearly had not passed them on to him. That's when Wells finally uncovered this truth. And to top it all off, the money that the Spanish producer was delivering to Wells that he claimed was his own was actually that money from the Iranians. So he never actually contributed a dime to the production. Orson later reflected, "We just sat month after month while he went to Paris, received the money, and came back that he hadn't gotten any money. He was very convincing to us and very convincing with them in Paris. He kept flying back and forth, extracting money from them. We didn't know them, you see, we knew him." It wasn't until 2008 that the Spanish producer Andres Vincent Gomez was identified to the public as that Spanish producer.
I read he blamed me because of the finance fiasco, which is totally untrue. I made a settlement with him. There was no complaint, there was no anything.
It was also around this time that Rich Little left the project. There were various explanations to why he left the project. He claims that he had a strict deadline he had to get out of there for. Others claimed he was fired. The true story isn't really known. Regardless of the reason, Little's exit was, in hindsight, a minor blessing for the project, as he never really embraced Wells' method, which was evident in all of the footage. With Little gone, Wells needed to recast one of the film's biggest parts and reshoot many of the film's major scenes. He turned to Bogdanovich for advice, and Bogdanovich suggested that he should just play the role.
All right, man, let's get organized. Now, where should we start?
He is a rough magician.
magician, isn't he?
Huh. What a strange idea.
I thought I'd be a failure if I didn't make a movie, at least by the time I was 25, which is when Orson made Citizen Kane, and I was a disaster because I didn't make one until I was 27.
At the beginning of the film's production, Bogdanovich's life closely resembled that of his original character. Now having directed The Last Picture Show and being nominated for multiple Oscars, it almost seems that it would be natural that he would step into Otter Lake's shoes. As Welles closed in on the finish line, he moved into Bogdanovich's Beverly Hills home in 1974 to shoot the final scenes, a process that stretched over the span of the next 2 years. Despite the progress, Welles still needed more money to complete the film. One final big swing for financing came in 1975 when Welles was honored with the 3rd AFI Lifetime Achievement Award. Although Welles felt uneasy about accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, though he was finally beginning to be recognized for his other work that were largely dismissed because of the box office disappointment, this award was given to people nearing the end of their careers, which Welles did not feel like he was reaching. But Welles saw this night dedicated to him as an opportunity to schmooze and get some more money for his coming masterpiece. This did not go according to plan.
The unfinished movie that Jake is making, for which he needs end money.
His heartwarming speech went on for a little too long, and many can see through his desperation. And although he claimed to have received an offer, ultimately this night amounted to nothing financially for the movie. By 1976, the film's production finally wrapped. But Welles found himself short on funds to finish the editing. The leadership change at the Iranian production company backing the film led to mistrust, and they refused to pay Welles any more money, forcing him to only work on the film in his spare time, funneling whatever money he made from acting jobs back into the project. As the Iranian Revolution heated up, things became more complex. Welles was offered a deal that would take the film's control out of the Iranians' hands. The deal even had Boucherie's signature already on it. All Welles had to do was approve of it. The terms of the deal were generous. James George, a former Canadian ambassador and who was writing to Welles about this deal, offered to buy the film's rights from the Iranians for $1.18 million, which would let Welles keep control over Final Cut and give him 10 months to finish the film. They also promised a deposit of $500,000 into a Los Angeles bank account so Welles can pay off any remaining debts. Despite these favorable conditions, Welles still hesitated. George sent multiple letters urging Welles to sign before they lost Boucherie's final signature. But Welles just kept asking for more changes and became increasingly elusive. And after months of no communication, this deal just went nowhere. It's impossible to understate the lack of faith Welles had in the people he should have trusted. After years of being rejected by the industry he loved, the self-destructive behavior born out of the constant betrayal he felt manifested in these legal battles over the film. Not even Bogdanovich, the man who had been loyal to him all of these years, was immune to Welles' self-destructive path that he was going down.
We have a mutual friend, of course, Peter Bogdanovich.
That's right.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, you have me to thank for the fact that you were asked to be in the picture, which was probably the least successful of any in your past. My feeling was that the picture needed you.
Yeah. No, it needed a lot more.
That's right.
I tuned in last night to see what you think about me. I guess I found out. And he sent me back a envelope with 2 letters in it. One said he was absolutely horrified and that he felt he'd betrayed our friendship. And the other letter said I deserved it. He said, take your pick.
Legal battles ensued between Welles and the Iranians over the span of the next few years, eventually causing the negative to be locked up in Paris, with nobody able to access it. As the years trudged on, nothing changed.
Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, some of those early films, they said Bogdanovich is the best we've got. He's on his way. They don't say that anymore. What happened?
Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. Right. Many years later, we started talking on the phone again a bit, but it wasn't the same. And I said to him, I feel like I made so many mistakes. And he said, well, it does seem to be impossible to go through life without making a great many of them. He died within a week later.
As the years went on, legal battles continued between the Welles estate, Graver, Oya, and Bogdanovich. Everyone wanted the movie to get made, and everyone wanted a piece of the pie that they were promised. There were constant reports of deals being finalized, but nothing ever came of them. It wasn't until 2014, when Royal Road Entertainment successfully purchased the rights to the film, that it finally had a chance at release. Frank Marshall, once a line producer on the project, had become a Hollywood mogul. I guess things worked out for him. I doubted him, honestly. Along with Bogdanovich, the two of them would oversee the project. In 2016, Netflix purchased a 2-picture deal worth $5 million for the completion of the film and a companion documentary. Then, in 2018, the world finally got to see The Other Side of the Wind, the film that years before his death, Welles deemed would be his masterpiece, when Netflix released it into hundreds of millions of homes all around the world. The film was met with universal critical praise. To nobody's surprise, it isn't a film meant for all audiences. The new Hollywood movement was long gone. The Other Side of the Wind finally got its chance in the spotlight in the age of social media. Many people likely watched this for the first time on their laptops, on their phones, or maybe over the span of a couple of days as they paused it then returned back to it. A way of consuming movies that didn't even exist when Welles was alive. Welles claimed that this movie wasn't autobiographical. Hemingway's masculinity, which he intended to analyze in the film, is absolutely present. But Welles presents this idea through a fictionalized version of himself.
But he's become obsessed by this young man who has become, in a way, his own dream of him. He's been rejected by all his old friends. He's finally been shown up to be a kind of voyeur, a peeker, a second-hand guy, a fellow who lives off other people's danger and death.
Although he refused to admit how deeply personal the film was, that's what makes it so good. Over the span of the film's long production, Welles and Bogdanovich's relationship was constantly evolving. Bogdanovich became the filmmaker Welles was never able to be, a universally loved Hollywood director. Welles used The Other Side of the Wind to cope with that fact. The student becomes the master and leaves the teacher behind. Bogdanovich never left Welles behind, but because he became what Welles always dreamed of being, it felt like a betrayal. Welles didn't take his own life in the end, like Hemingway and Hannaford did. But what Welles and Hannaford shared was a brutish individuality that wreaked havoc on their personal lives. While I don't claim to understand the nuances of Welles and Bogdanovich's relationship, I think The Other Side of the Wind offers a good explanation as to why Welles ultimately destroyed their relationship. Masculinity is directly tied to a false manifestation of stoicism, the masculine urge to isolate yourself, to be a man and face your problems alone, is what leads to the destruction of your relationships. Because of Welles's lack of financial success, he was never able to comfortably live the lavish lifestyle he often lived anyways. While being under constant financial pressure, it forced Welles to innovate. It wasn't the ignorance that young Welles possessed when he made Kane that led to the innovation on Wind. It was the need to survive. Welles was never going to be killed by the failure of Wind. His acting jobs and the celebrity image he built for himself kept him afloat. But as many artists know, time is always of the essence. Whether we're fighting against studio deadlines or biological deadlines, you want to spend that time creating something you're proud of. Sure, whiskey ads kept the lights on, but living in the Beverly Hills hotel for months at a time, editing a film by yourself is both humbling and humiliating for the man who helped innovate the modern motion picture. Netflix saving Welles's lost masterpiece was a miracle for the film community. Although people may not have understood the weight of Welles's legend while he was alive, film scholars everywhere have cemented him as one of the greatest ever. But I can't help but shake my head at the irony of the matter. Today, Netflix is one of, if not the biggest entertainment provider on the planet. Its introduction of the online streaming service has drastically changed the way that we consume media, whether it's for the better or oftentimes the worse. Welles was shut out by every major studio over the span of his career. Many never believed that he could ever surpass the greatness that was Citizen Kane. Now, Welles's swan song, the film he spent the last 2 decades of his life creating, has a permanent place on the streaming giant that is directly responsible for the decline of the movie-going experience, forever buried in a massive library that can only be catered to you by an algorithm. Maybe it is a happy ending. Maybe this is what Welles would have wanted, to gain the respect of the people at the top of the industry. I don't know. We'll never know. But if Welles did actually say to Bogdanovich, "They'll love me when I'm dead," I think The Other Side of the Wind is proof of that.